Hi everyone, welcome to Be Like Christ for our 5-minute Bible study series. Today we are in 1 Kings chapter 18. Sorry if I sound a little funny, I'm sick with something like the flu or something, but I think we'll make it through. There's a free PDF on our website that you can download, and now we've got several hundred PDFs all the way from Genesis through 1 Kings and soon to be 2 Kings. So if you want any of those, they're all out there available. You can download them, share them with people, use them in your personal study, use them if you're studying through a book in your church, and they're there for you. So let's talk about 1 Kings 18. First of all, we talk about our timeline. When did these events happen historically? Well, the kingdom of Israel in the north and Judah in the south divided in about 975 BC, about 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Now we are going to talk about the reign of Ahab, which is about 80 to 100 years after that. Ahab reigned for 22 years over Israel in the north. It'd be from approximately, these are approximate dates, round numbers, from somewhere between 920 and 890 BC probably. Our first two key characters are going to be familiar from the last chapter. We've got Elijah. He was a prophet of God who God used to condemn the wickedness of Israel and their king, Ahab. Then we have Ahab. Ahab was the son of Omri, who was king before him. He was one of, if not the most wicked king to rule over Israel, and he was also married to a very wicked woman, Jezebel. We're going to talk about a guy named Obadiah. There are a few Obadiahs in the Old Testament. This Obadiah was the overseer of all the things in Ahab's household. He's credited with protecting 100 prophets of God from Jezebel, Ahab's evil wife. Then we have 450 prophets of the idol Baal. These prophets, quotation marks, served a false god whose name was Baal, a very popular false god in the Old Testament that the people of God often went off and worshipped when they shouldn't have. Elijah challenges these 450 prophets and shows them that the true God in heaven is the one who needs to be followed, not this false god Baal. 3 locations to highlight on our map. If you remember in the last chapter, Elijah was at Zarephath with the widow whose son he raised from the dead. So he's at Zarephath at the beginning of the chapter during the drought that was taking place in Israel at that time. Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, which you'll see south of Zarephath on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Then at the end of the chapter, Elijah and Ahab go to a place called Jezreel. So if you remember at the beginning of chapter 17, we talked about Elijah going to King Ahab, telling him that because of his unfaithfulness and his wickedness, God was going to not allow it to rain in Israel. And so this caused a drought, all kinds of big problems. Now we're going to talk about Elijah being sent back to Ahab. So our first section, verses 1 through 19, Elijah is sent back to Ahab near the end of the drought. So this is several years later. In fact, the text says that God spoke to Elijah in the 3rd year of the drought and told him to go find Ahab. On his way, he met this guy named Obadiah, who was the overseer of Ahab's household. And as I mentioned, Obadiah was a God-fearing man. He hid several of the prophets of God when Jezebel and Ahab were trying to kill them. Elijah told Obadiah to go to Ahab and to tell him that he was going to be arriving very shortly. Now, initially, Obadiah was kind of hesitant to do this because Ahab had been hunting Elijah for a long time. And if he went to tell Ahab that Elijah had appeared and then Elijah disappeared during that time, he was going to end up in trouble with the king. But through his hesitation, eventually he told Ahab that Elijah was on his way. Well, sure enough, Elijah kept his word. He shows up to see Ahab, and Ahab accuses him of something really interesting, accuses him of being the, quote, troubler of Israel. And Elijah, of course, looks at him and he's like, look, I'm not the troubler of Israel. You're the troubler of Israel. You've brought this pain on your entire nation because you abandoned God's commands. Elijah then proposes basically a challenge to prove who the true God is. And this is a very famous section of the Old Testament, especially of Elijah's story. Elijah told Ahab to gather the people together at Mount Carmel to bring the 450 prophets of the false god Baal, and also there were 400 prophets of another false Canaanite god called Asherah. So that takes us into the famous section, verses 20 through 40. Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. So when Ahab had gathered all the people and all the prophets at the mountain, they're up on this mountain. It would have been a pretty incredible scene. Elijah basically demands an answer from all of the people. He says, right now you need to choose who you're going to follow, the true God or these false idols, but you can't choose both. When the people of Israel failed to respond definitively, Elijah challenged the prophets to a face-off, kind of a duel. Not a duel of personal strength, but between gods to find out which one was legitimate. Elijah and the prophets were going to each build an altar and put a bowl on that altar. Then they were supposed to cry out to their respective gods, and whichever god answered with fire coming down from heaven to consume the sacrifice, that would be the god who was shown to be legitimate. The prophets of Baal were up first. All morning they cried out to Baal, please send down fire from heaven. Guess what? Nothing happened. Then it was Elijah's turn, and just for good measure, Elijah had 12 jars of water poured on the bowl and on his altar, because wet things are hard to burn. So if fire came down from heaven and consumed this thing, they were going to know it was from God. Elijah then prayed to God, and God answered his prayer. The text says that fire fell from heaven and consumed the bowl, the wood, the stones, the dust that was around the altar, and even the water that was surrounding the altar from, the runoff of all the water poured on it initially. And when the people saw it, this gave them the answer that they should have given prior to this. They fell on their faces, they worshipped the true God of heaven, and Elijah had all 450 false prophets put to death. So now that we see this purging of idolatry in Israel, this wickedness is kind of in some ways purged out of the land. Now God is ready to send rain back to Israel. Rain returns to Israel. This finishes up the chapter, verses 41 through 46. So on the top of Mount Carmel, Elijah prayed for rain 7 times. After the 7th time, Elijah's servant went to the sea and looked out, and he saw a cloud. We're told that the cloud was about the size of a man's hand. So this was all Elijah needed to confirm that God was going to answer his prayer, that rain was coming back to Israel. He commanded Ahab, the king, to get in his chariot and to go to Jezreel before his chariot got stuck in the mud from all the rain that was coming. Sure enough, the sky became very dark and heavy rain poured down on Israel for the first time in 3 years. 3.5 years, actually, we're told in some other passages. Then the chapter concludes with this really interesting fact. It says that the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. God empowered Elijah. Ahab had already left in his horse-drawn chariot back to Jezreel. Text tells us that Elijah, with the power of God, outran Ahab back to the city. Really interesting detail that the text includes. Now this takes us to our application section. It's common for wicked people to try to blame followers of God for the problems that we see in our culture, pretending that, everything would just be better if Christians would stop trying to impose their beliefs on other people. But in reality, it's the wicked and the godless people who ruin cultures. It's self-created morality and proud self-governance that make places unlivable. Ahab tries to pull this, right? He looks at Elijah and he says, oh, you're the troubler of Israel, when in fact, it was Ahab's own wickedness that had dried up and cursed his own land. So don't fall for this tactic of Ahab in the modern day. Christian values save nations. Godless nations descend into depravity.